All right, I think we can start. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Eloisa Boneto. I'm a project manager at Effective, the translation and localization company. And I'm going to be the moderator of this webinar. It is called Machine Translation in Localization Workflows. And it is the first in our series of webinars on practical application of modern translation, localization, and interpretation technologies. The webinar will be conducted by Stepan Korotaev, our CTO and Head of Research and Development. During the webinar, your mics and cameras will be switched off, but you can type in questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will address your questions during a dedicated Q&A session at the end of our presentation. During the webinar, we will run several short polls to better understand our audience and its needs. We'll be very grateful if you take a minute to participate in these polls. It'll help us developing future webinars addressing more specific needs and use cases. Please note that this session will be recorded and then sent to all participants for future reference. So now I'll hand it over to Stepan.
Hi, folks. As Eloisa mentioned, my name is Stepan, and I'll be your host today. So let's jump straight in and start with our company. In a nutshell, we're a translation, localization, interpretation company with a very strong focus on R&D, including machine translation. We're also focused on partnerships, and that allows us to create solutions for complex and unique needs of our clients. And I put some of it on the slide, but you know what? It's probably the most boring part of any presentation when you're forced to hear someone bragging about their achievements and successes. So why not make it a bit more engaging? Let me run our first poll today to learn slightly more about you, about our audience. So I'd appreciate it if you could take a second to participate. And now let me run it. So here are my polls. A bit ominous title. Who do you work for? But please take a minute to select an option. And I'll be waiting for maybe 35 seconds, and then I'll share the results. Right, and already I can see that an overwhelming majority of our audience are from translation companies. So our colleagues, so results, answers keep coming. So I'll keep it on for a while. So just take your time. Okay, so let me probably end this poll and share results, right? So as you can see, the majority of our audience today is from translation companies, and we don't have independent researchers, consultants, but we have representatives from large business, small and medium-sized business, and startups, which is also a good thing. So, okay, moving on with our presentation. Let me just close it. Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. And let's take a minute to talk about what this webinar is not about. Again, you can see it on the slide. So on the whole, I'm going to walk you over some of the important junctions that exist, both in terms of how you can use machine translation in your processes, and most importantly, what you should be aware of when dealing with more practical aspects of its implementation, machine translation implementation, as was advertised, how not to get cheated in the first place. Overall, the webinar is high level, and hopefully we'll follow it up with other sessions focused on more detailed use cases and technology overviews. Okay, now that we know what it's not about, right? And I hope you read it all. Let's take a look at our today's topics. And again, I know that agenda slides are not so super exciting. So let me run another poll for your entertainment only. Please help me make it representative. So what's your role, right? So what's your role in your organization? Again, I'd appreciate it if you could take a second to let us know. So you can be a dedicated localization manager, right? So someone whose role is solely focused on developing and maybe creating, developing localization programs within your organization. Maybe a product manager who's responsible for the whole of the product, but localization is also somewhere within your realm. Maybe you're kind of a jack of all trades. So maybe in a smaller organization and everybody wants everything from you and you need to, well, to be super quick, including when some localization needs come up. Maybe you're a C-level person. So again, I'm gonna keep it on for maybe several more seconds. And then I'll wrap it up. Yeah, but results keep coming. So maybe I'll give it a bit more time. Okay. I'm going to give us some time to finish this. In the meantime, if you have questions, as Eloisa mentioned, you can ask them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer some of these questions in the background in writing, and we'll dedicate more time to this in the end during a Q&A session. But you don't need to wait till this session to type your questions. So go ahead whenever you feel up to it. Okay, so here are our results. I'm sharing them with you right away. So share results. Yeah, well, a lot of dedicated localization managers, but probably some of you who indicated yourselves as dedicated localization managers. Maybe you meant that you were localization managers in your LSPs, right? So probably this is something that I should specify more clearly, because localization manager for me is someone who works on the buyer side. So you're someone who works with LSPs, for example, as your contractors, but it doesn't really matter. So in any case, it's interesting stats. So let me stop sharing this and close it. Okay, so moving on to our first meaningful slide, which is, okay. So the current state of machine translation. And again, it's very high level, a very quick overview of the current state of machine translation. And the first thing first, as many of you probably know, and most certainly know, neural machine translation has won the battle, and in a very decisive manner. And if you heard about rule-based or statistical models even a few years ago, I don't think you've heard much about them lately. In practical terms, it doesn't mean much for you as a user, as you could use Google Translate when it was based on statistical models, and now you use it in its new NMT-based form. It doesn't make much difference for you, but except for the quality, of course. But I just needed to mention it. Couldn't leave this base untouched. A very significant feature of today's machine translation landscape is the abundance of providers. Just plethora of them. So again, on the surface, many people think it starts with Google and maybe ends with Microsoft or Amazon as leading machine translation providers. But in fact, there are dozens of companies, large and small, and there is no one single certified best solution for all language pairs, subject matters, etc., etc. You always need to test, keep an eye out for everything that's going on, new developments, and try different approaches to ensure best results. Another very important aspect of modern machine translation is so-called training. In simple words, it means that you can increase your machine translation quality by feeding your model linguistic data that are specific to your product, domain, brand style, or maybe some other parameters of your product. If you're a company with an array of previously translated materials, say you have a website in different languages, or user manuals in different languages, or help documentation in different languages, then you already have this data. And of course, now you need to make it useful for the purposes of training. You need to clean it, you need to prepare it, but if you have it in one form or the other, it's already half battle won. Let's now move on to the next slide and talk about some other aspects. Machine translation systems exist in different shapes and forms. The most affordable and easily accessible one is translation services on the web. It's free. You all know it. You can just paste your text there and get your translation almost immediately. The most recognizable example is probably still Google Translate, but similar functionalities currently offered by very many providers. Let's take a look on the next slide. For example, just an example of a well-known MT system called DeepL. It's widely used for European languages in the first place. So you see, I just pasted my text here and got my translation immediately, and it's free, right? So, but somehow it's more suited for a casual user, as you can see. For MT to work efficiently in a corporate setting, it must be integrated into workflows and not rely on copy pasting. Just imagine you have a huge PDF file with your user manual. You can put it here in this window, and you can keep pasting, copy pasting back and forth. It's just impossible to imagine. Or maybe you have a software built with UI strings. So again, you need your machine translation integrated into your workflows. Another important consideration here is confidentiality. Free services in most cases do not offer that. Whatever you send Google's way becomes Google's property if you resort to these free online services. So it's more of a toy than a real tool when we talk about incorporating MT into some serious workflows. But, and it's very important for the purposes of these presentations, and overall, this toy can become dangerous and undermine many of your efforts in the area of quality control when it's misused by different participants of your workflows, including your translators. And I'll circle back to it later in greater detail. So let's now move on. And looking away from these ubiquitous free online machine translation systems that I just showed on my previous slide, we find ourselves staring in disbelief at a really diverse picture. So here's a chart published by Intento as part of their annual study on machine translation, where, by the way, we were one of the partners in that study, and I can highly recommend it. So what do we see here? So we see stock models, which means pre-trained models that you can't do much with except for using them as they are. Models supporting training, one kind or the other. Open source models that you can try and deploy in your own environment. Various approaches to terminology management and model adaptation training. So it's like entering a door, knowing that there is this normal thing called Google Translate, and the world is spinning and everything's okay. But then suddenly you're like falling into this rabbit hole with all this plethora of options and what to do. And again, no single solution for a random problem. So you have a problem, you don't know what kind of problem it is in advance. And you're thinking, well, I have a solution. I used it for my previous problem, but you know what? This time it might not work out as well. So you just need to be able to be flexible. Okay, and then to the confidentiality problem. And here I just took a page, quite literally, from our onboarding guide for customers wanting to implement some kind of machine translation-oriented workflows. A lot of considerations here. But the good thing is, so when you work with enterprise-oriented machine translation systems, you have various safeguards in place. You can even go as far as installing everything within your perimeter on your servers. It's going to cost you, of course, and overall this setup is much less flexible, but you can do that if you like. And even if you go with cloud, you have much more detailed agreements and levels of protection to keep your data safe. Okay, now to the price question. So somewhat tangentially, but all these options we've just seen, this capability of integration in your workflows, confidentiality, it must cost something, doesn't it? And yeah, it does. I'm not sure if you can read this chart with confidence. It's a bit convoluted. And again, it's from our partner study with Intenta, but it's a very large spectrum of prices. And usually you're charged by character. And except for some outliers, it's around $20 per million characters normally. But it all depends on your volumes, on other specifics of your usage. But overall, it's important to understand that this is just a fraction of your cost. You'll need post-editing on top of this, and we'll discuss it later in more detail. You'll need training, and custom trained models that you train for yourself are normally more expensive. You'll need data preparation, terminology management, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll need a lot of things on top of this baseline price of your machine translation model. So going back to this question, is machine translation really cheap? Well, it's mostly cheaper than other approaches, let's put it this way. But its main value is in its scalability and versatility rather than pure price. So with a proper empty workflow in place, you can do things so much faster. You can scale up your production in a jiffy. So in a day, you can took it down. Yeah, so in a day, you can have more words translated using machine translation than all the translators in the world could do in a year combined. Just imagine that. That's the main value of this technology. It's scaling up rapidly, and it gives you a lot of opportunities. And now let me run our, let me run our last poll today. And it's gonna be about how you're implementing machine translation in your current processes. Help us learn a little more about it, please. So I'll run this poll, and waiting for the results, I'll take a short break in the meantime. So please, I'm launching it. Yeah, here it is. So again, I appreciate your participation. Okay, I'm back. Thank you for participating. And now I'm ending this poll and sharing results. And here they are. Yeah, so most of our audience tried their hand with machine translation in one way or the other, but mostly in certain workflows, products, markets. So maybe you have a diverse picture where some markets are better suited for machine translation and some others require more manual workflows, maybe not so manual, but rather human translation driven. Maybe this is the right way to put it. Okay, so I'm stop sharing this poll. This was our last poll today. So no more trouble for you, I promise. But I still hope that you'll be active with your questions. Okay, so going forward, Another very important and interesting slide on our agenda is myths and misconceptions around MT. And there are many, like very, very many. MT as a business, and much overhyped at times, had been around for many, many years before neural networks even came to the fore and really changed the game. And many people had tried it and felt somewhat defrauded because, let's be honest, it wasn't that good on average. Previously, like maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And this attitude has somehow carried over to even modern, much more advanced systems. But if you reject them now on the grounds of this old attitude, it's a mistake. On the other hand, it was one myth, like you can see it on the slide. And on the other hand, machine translation is not a silver bullet either. It's not gonna solve everything. And for every business or market, every product, it's what it is. And neural networks, it's an incredibly powerful tool that any localization program should have in its arsenal. But it's not an infinity stone, so to speak. Well, at least not all of them in one gauntlet. So let me elaborate on some of the other myths, moving to our next slide. For metrics, what are those? It's a way to measure quality of our machine translation model. In most cases, comparing its output to a so-called reference data set. The idea is we have some human translations and we give our model same source sentences, right? And it learns to produce output, which we measure, comparing it to our reference translation. The closer it is to this reference translation, the better. So we measure our model before a training session, then after this session. And if a metric has gone up, which means our machine translation is now closer in some ways to our reference human translation, then kudos to us, big success. You can already see some of the shortcomings of this approach. First of all, who said that our reference translations are any good? It can be a huge data set. How do you know? And if you train your model to become increasingly more similar to a not so good reference translation, what's the purpose of it? And then there is this problem that you can very often say the very same thing in different ways. Why penalize a model if its way of saying something is somewhat different from a reference translation? And this latter problem is, of course, addressed in more advanced metrics to a degree, but it's still a problem. And then on top of all that, a super important question, and again, in the context of this presentation and my personal angle, it's maybe one of the most important questions. We strive to bring our model closer to what we perceive as human translation, but who said that what you think is human produced really is? So remember those free online translators we talked about? You've been sending your texts for translation to your translators for years, and being clever and being very adaptable and human beings, they learn to optimize and to use technology to speed up their work. I'm not saying that all of them doing this, but you'd be surprised how many, to a degree that we even had to develop a methodology to identify unsanctioned machine translation in our own workflows. So the point is, you may think your data set is purely human translated, but in fact, it can be 80% or 90%, 75% Google translated. And now you're trying to teach a different model, let's say Microsoft, or maybe you chose Microsoft as your main provider, and you're training its models, and you train it to be closer to what? Google? Well, it sounds absurd, right? But that's what might easily happen if you don't pay attention. And all the metrics will go up, and you'll be happy with your rapid advancement, but you might as well switch to Google right away and stop wasting your time and money, because that's what you're doing. You're just moving your Microsoft model closer to Google. because you thought that it wasn't Google, it was human translated. But how do you know? That being said, metrics are useful. So I'm not saying that this is some garbage. No, of course not. They're important. They're getting better all the time. And a lot of clever people invest their time in figuring out how to make them even better. But they're not enough. They're not enough as your only mechanism to control quality. So, and this is another myth that maybe some people believe, and I know that they do, that you can use metrics and this is also big on up and everything's under control, but it's not. So another very interesting topic was how machine translation stacks up against us humans. And I've touched on this already. So 15 years ago, we saw something stylistically ugly or outright nonsensical, and we yelled in delight, machine translation, busted, hey! But now, your translators are using it, and little by little, their style, even when they try to work without it on their own, without using any machine translation, without asking help from the machine, their style has already changed. They train their own brains just like we train our models. On the other side, on the buyer side, expectations are also changing. Again, being subjected to an overwhelming incoming flow of machine translation, we're adjusting as buyers as well. We're not so sure anymore. Is the machine, or maybe post-edited translation, machine translation, or is it just a new norm and I'm just being too picky, trying to find some faults with this more or less okay text? So what about so-called human parity? And you could see it on one of the previous slides where all those myths and misconceptions were listed. Conceptually, it means that our machine translation in its raw form, just out of our model, is as good as human translation. What is meant by as good as is if you give it a large enough sample of machine and human translations, if you give this sample to an independent evaluator, then this person won't be able to tell the difference. So it's a kind of a Turing test, right? So the machine should prove to be indistinguishable from a human. In reality, though, experiments like this are very shaky. As many of you probably know, they are very hard to verify and replicate. For some texts, more technical stuff with less ambiguity, a large amount of predictable structures, like user help, for example, machine translation can be on par with humans. And this parity can be even verified and replicated. But in most cases, experiments are too narrow and don't hold water, so to speak, when we start looking at real life cases. And most importantly, though, machine translation should not be compared directly to human translation. It is just a different animal, a completely different animal. It's close to human translation, sorry, but it's different. It can coincide with human output. It can deviate from it, but it will never be the same. It's just different in its nature, even though it can and does replace human translation in many cases. On the other hand, as I mentioned just now, the line between machine translation and human translation is getting blurrier and blurrier. So maybe this mythical parity can be achieved after all, but not because machine translation has become as good as human translation, and rather because at some point we won't be able to separate the two at all. Okay, so to summarize, here are some of the indications that you should jump on this fast-moving empty bandwagon right now, or you're really hurting yourselves. Some language combinations will work better than others. Sometimes you have all the data for training you need readily available for you, and sometimes you need to work for it. But if you need to enter new markets quickly, have short release times, a lot of more technical stuff, documentation, just go for it. And please take note of this last point in red. I mean, You might be thinking, my translators are working so hard, they keep my product afloat, it's not a good time to change horses in midstream, etc., etc. And maybe you're right. But what if you're already getting almost totally machine translated text? And then probably maybe slightly post-edited, and you're getting it from the very translators that you think are so crucial for your success. Well, just think about it. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. So it means machine translation works for you. So your translators already using it. You just don't know that. But the results are good. And it's good. It has been good for a while for you. You just didn't know it. So it's very important to take some time to analyze what's going on in your workflows and what you're getting. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. A couple of words on where exactly you can implement machine translation in your localization workflows, right? If you work for an organization that develops some products, for example, maybe it's an IT company or a startup. Of course, it merits a separate webinar, maybe a series of webinars. But in a nutshell, unlike the old approach, often called the waterfall approach, where you would need to wait until everything or almost everything is coded, designed, etc., and then wait for your translators to catch up, to do their job, and then validate if everything's okay. Essentially, spending a lot of time waiting and playing this catch up with your localization effort, delaying everything else. So unlike this old-fashioned approach, with machine translation and a more agile approach, and it's often called continuous localization, you can keep abreast with the development efforts. You can start as early as a design stage, in fact. So you need to check if text on your buttons stays where it should after a new language with potentially longer words is applied. You can do this before you even started coding anything. Similarly, at the development stage, you can constantly send your UI string back and forth thanks to the integration between like your repository, say GitHub, and a translation system. So it's really a self-sustained cycle where everything moves in sync, ideally. Of course, it takes a lot of time to set it up, but once it's started working, it works in sync and doesn't put any brakes on your process. So as a quick example, let's take a look at the design stage I mentioned. So it's one of the important stages. This is where your designer draws screens for your mobile app, for instance. In most cases, it's done with a particular language in mind. So you have an English-speaking designer, and they work, of course, thinking in English and having English as their primary language and primary market. But all sorts of things might happen once your interface is translated into a different language. Longer sentences, truncations of various kinds, different data formats, right to left languages, for God's sake, like Arabic. So it's really useful when you can get a grip on this as quickly as possible. Yeah, and by the way, if you don't know what a CAT system is and see the last point on the slide, let us know after the webinar and we'll be happy to help you sort it out. So it's also a very important concept in the translation industry that you need to know about. And okay, so I'll run this little video now where just to illustrate this point about the design stage. So let me just start it. It's just a simple screen that I created in Figma, one of the well-known design tools. Sorry about this. Escape. So can I start it now? Okay, so I have some problems with starting my video. Oh, no, it has started. Okay, so Basically here, I just send all my strings to memsource, one of the well-known translation systems. And so all this text on these buttons that you can see or could see on my screen, start analysis, etc., it's sent to memsource automatically. And then it's immediately translated in memsource. I don't need to go there. It all happens. So of course, this stuff requires some setting up in advance. But once it's set up, it goes back and forth. And so I sent it for translation, and now I got it back. And I can immediately see how in the Spanish view, right? I can immediately see how my buttons look like. So with this machine translated Spanish text. So so we have several UI elements here, and we just translated them, and I can immediately see here in Figma how my app would look like in Spanish, right? So instead of a waterfall approach where I would need to design it, send it to my team, and they will code it, and then we'll have some strings, and then we'll have to freeze everything and wait till the translation is back, and then we'll deploy some builds and see how it looks. And here, just prior to any coding stage, I can already see how things might unfold and where are some usability, UI, UX problems. So it was just a quick demo of one of the scenarios that can be implemented. Okay, so now a bit on inclusion. And we all know that it's paramount to make your content accessible to all people who might need it. And when we talk about translation, we always talk about compromises. Machine translation is also a compromise, but a compromise that you should be willing to make when it comes to serving your customers. If your product is about chatbots, call centers, other means of direct communication with your customer, and you can help them use your product, even at the expense of 100% stylistic quality, clarity, you still should do that. People able to read in their own language will, in most cases, gladly forgive you some occasional mishaps. And if machine translation in itself is not enough, you can include a human, a so-called human in the loop concept, also very important, to amend results, right? To amend your results. And it's much faster than translating from scratch. Microsoft, for example, has been using raw machine translation for ages, or for its help pages, and it works well enough. So it's in your language, in your local language. Sometimes it's a bit ugly. Sometimes you need to figure it out and, well, maybe guess some parts of it. But overall, it's pretty cool. So this is another area you should definitely pay attention to. Okay, so now is a slide on model selection, another important aspect. And as I mentioned, the landscape is very complex. All these colored circles in this chart, and I hope you can see them, denote different machine translation systems that perform better or worse based on a language combination and domain, like healthcare, legal, etc. So in one domain, it's one system, and a different system in the other domain, or in a different language combination, and it's just a small sample of engines. So it's an important and time-consuming step to select the right model out of all the viable alternatives, and you need to invest in it. Otherwise, you might, well, end up with some pointed results. The methodology is also very important. So once you've narrowed your selection to several machine translation systems using metrics and other automated tools, how do you pick out the best? How do you pick out the best out of them? And again, you'll need a human expert for that to review and compare output from different systems, and maybe post-edit some of it so we could see what kind of changes were needed. This is a common approach, and it was used in intent study as well. So basically, someone has to review various versions of machine translated segment and choose which one is better. For example, you have the same source sentence translated by Google, Microsoft, DeepL, some other engines, And now your reviewer sees all these versions without knowing which one is translated by which engine, of course, and marks the one that they like better. If you use several translators, it also helps because you can average their scores and come to some conclusions with more confidence. This is how it works in most cases, though the methodology is not without its deficiencies, I should say. So, for instance, if it's just hard for any human reviewer to compare quite similar machine translation outputs and be able to consistently choose the best one out of them. So the process is prone to becoming too monotonous, probably, and random because of that. So very similar translations, and you go through all of them, and you need to choose one of them. And how do you choose them? So it's really hard to keep doing it consistently. So Effective, our company, we have a slightly different methodology, which makes this task more productive, hopefully, and reliable by adding more variation into this process. And I think we will dedicate a separate webinar to this important dimension of this. But methodology, how you include a human reviewer into the process, is very important. Another very important aspect is terminology, because consistency in terminology is key to your brand voice and also to your technical documentation. And on the whole, this problem of terminology exists separately from machine translation. It is relevant regardless of how you translate or even author your content. However, what can be said of the terminology problem in the context of machine translation? Well, there are some pertinent things that are very specific for this for this area. So the first thing to know is that you can't literally teach your model terminology, but just feeding it a glossary, for example. You can use a glossary with more and more, increasingly more empty systems together, but the glossary translations are just superimposed over the machine translation output. And it can create a lot of trouble in languages with a richer morphology, because your glossary will only contain one form of a word, an initial form, and it can be in a different form in your machine translated text. So using glossary in this way may create a lot of minor typo-like mistakes that somebody will have to correct afterwards as a separate step. It doesn't mean that glossaries can't be used. They are an important tool, but again, no silver bullet. Wherever you look in machine translation, it's no silver bullets. You always need to find a way to achieve your goals, and these ways are very different. Going back to terminology, a more sustainable approach is to keep training your model on new or maybe modified old data, making sure it's terminologically consistent. Well, meaning that you have a lot of segments and the terminology is consistent across these segments. It requires a lot of work, of course. Imagine this glossary of several hundred terms, and it can be more. And all of them need to be checked in a parallel corpus of several 100,000 segments, maybe. Well, I mean, a lot of work. So outsource it whenever you can. That would be my advice. Well, and after all this talk about machine translation and how it can solve all your problems, now this. Well, but you know what? Most of these contraindications, let's put it this way, they can be overcome. So don't shut yourself out from machine translation, even if you see familiar problems on this slide. The only exception is probably the last bullet. So for example, if you're a translation company, right, and your customer directly prohibits any use of machine translation, well, you can't do it for this particular customer. It's a big no. But this is the only case where it's so strict. So otherwise, you can always at least try and see where it can lead you. So give it a try. Okay, so here is are do's and don'ts. I'm not going to spend much time on it because we've already covered all these points, and you can review it later when you have a link to the recording of this webinar in your inbox. But note the last row about hiring and training post editors, because it brings us to the next topic, which is post editing, right? And yeah, it's a really broad topic. And we have a very high level webinar, but I've already mentioned several times how important it is to include people in your MT processes. Human in the loop, again, the very same concept. So who are those mystical post editors? And why do I call them mystical? It's because everyone seems to be talking about them, but there is still a good deal of confusion about who they are and what they actually do. So let's start with the letter. Okay, so post editors are people who amend raw machine translation output. That's what they do. They are critical, as raw machine translation in very many cases is too far from satisfactory still, despite all the advances. And again, it all depends on a myriad of factors, but post editing as a rule is needed in very many situations. So how do post editors do their job? Are they actually editors just working with machine translation instead of human translation? Or is it a separate craft and totally separate skills needed to do this job? And there are different opinions on this. But my take is that tech skills remain the same. The ability to spot mistakes, to keep concentration and focus, to quickly make changes, improving the text. It's all shared among all good editors, post editors or not post editors. And I don't agree with those who say that this person is an average editor. Let's try her as a post editor instead. No, the skill set that is needed remain the same. And still, the craft is somewhat different. As we discussed, machine translation is different too. Even as the line between machine translation and human translation is getting less and less visible. So some people don't like working with machine translation. There are people who just don't want to deal with that, because the material may seem way too mechanical, lacking in variance, stylistically primitive, etc., and that can be. But most people hesitant to start their post-editing career just lack guidance. They're not sure what to do, they don't understand your expectations, and they're not sure if the pay is good enough. All these aspects need to be managed. And I'll be talking more about it, moving to our next slide. So what about how deeply a post editor should work with the machine translation output? There are several common levels. You can see them on the slide. The post editing activity has been even how should I put it, codified with an ISO standard in place. You can see it on the right. But as with most other linguistic activities like translation or editing, it's not as much about general instructions and style guides, even though they are important, but it's more about your particular expectations in terms of quality, time, price, and the ability to clearly communicate these expectations to your post editors. So you can't just say, like, here's an ISO standard, I need this empty post edited, all mistakes corrected, and the price is half of what I'd pay for translation from scratch. It should be much more nuanced, with several rounds of feedback and constant adjustments. Do you like what you get as a result? If not, what else would you want to see? More stylistic changes, less stylistic changes, more attention paid to complex long sentences. And are you ready to pay more to get this deeper level of corrections from your contractor? So only if you're approaching this as a process, this is the only way for you to stand a really good chance of success. And briefly on the levels themselves. So raw MC means nothing. Nothing is done by a human. Zero post editing. Light PE refers to some less significant changes, but it's a totally gray area, I should tell you. So to be honest, always communicate because, well, nobody knows for sure. And full PE, well, it's like human parity again in a slightly different context and form. So it's like a full PE equals good translation from scratch. But we've already discussed that there is no such thing when it comes to machine translation. So it's just a different thing. So it's not parity per se. It's your expectations, which is much more important. And again, these are our do's and don'ts as regards post-editing. And I should probably shed some light on how you should or can pay your post-editors. Again, there is no single best practice, and you should be open to different scenarios depending on your content, volumes, and even accounting system. So you can pay by word, as is usually done or when you deal with human translators, by time actually spent on post-editing. It's subjective, but sometimes just the best solution, the only one you can employ. By edit distance, which means you pay more if there are more changes made by a post-editor, but you can immediately see how it can be used by your contractors, right? So again, no silver bullet. And now that we're in the home stretch of our webinar, it's the last slides. And probably this is the most exciting part, right? So how not to get cheated and who's cheating? Well, first of all, let me tell you, don't cheat yourselves. So you do that, exactly that, if you don't use machine translation conceptually, I mean, as a process, when it's already used by all your providers. Stop doing this. I mean, makes no sense. Embrace the situation and take advantage. Then cut off all the slackers. I mean, a lot of people work incredibly hard in our business. Translators, editors, post-editors, proofreaders, they are the cream of the crop, really, and deserve nothing but praise and admiration. But machine translation, as legit as it is now, is still a very hyped up business. And where it's hype, as you know, there is always people very keen on making easy money. So post-editors doing nothing or next to nothing would be one example. Translators submitting their work as if translated by them, whereas in fact, the translation was just copy-pasted, as we saw, from a free online translator, with all the consequences for quality and confidentiality. So establish procedures for quality assurance. Stop this. And I'll cover this a bit later, so let me switch to my next slide. So bringing it down a notch, so it was very on the whole about the situation. But here's how we control our post editors in-house. As you can see, we plot charts showing the amount of changes, how extensive they are, and how these changes are distributed along the whole length of a given file. So you don't want your post editor to start changing things enthusiastically and then just switch to autopilot mode in the second part of the document. So it's not what we want to see from our editors. So it's important how these changes are distributed. So you need tools to be able to monitor that, and we implemented it as a web service, but there are different ways of doing this. Be consistent with your quality control tools, or otherwise things might start really unraveling. Another example of your QA safeguards would be this terminology check, that it can be run as a separate step after the document is post-edited. So here, just an Excel log, right, with all the found errors. But again, there are many ways of doing it and incorporating this step into your processes. So as we mentioned, terminology is tricky, right? So it just requires special attention. Okay, so circling back to this problem of the unsanctioned use of machine translation by your providers, what should you do about it? I mean, it's not all bad if your translators learned how to speed up their work using machine translation. So they're clever. Kudos to them. As long as you're happy with their results, of course. So it's not about punishing people as much as just better understanding where you are. If you understand that your current quality is good, it's mostly machine translated already, and you're yet to implement a structured machine translation program, well, it's time to make some changes and start manage this process. Okay, so you need to manage this instead of sitting the driver's seat to your contractors. Think about confidentiality of your clients. Think about gains you can make by training your models as opposed to settling for stock output that your translators, well, if left to their own devices, scoop from generic services like Google Translate. So you can control it, you can direct it the way you want. Or you can just, well, lay back and let it slide. Just understand where you are. That's the message, and how you want to move forward. And then act, of course. And now here's just another little example from our practice to identify cases where translators quite possibly use machine translation. So we use this kind of notification. So we monitor our translation system, and based on a certain algorithm, sample various translated segments, compare them with some more popular engines like Google, Microsoft, maybe Yandex, maybe some other engines. And if they coincide to a degree, well, which is, or it's a threshold that is set up, it triggers a notification sent to a manager, and then it leads to a more thorough investigation and discussion with the translator. Okay, so why do we do this? So, and then, well, sometimes it's a situation when you have to find people. Sometimes it's a situation when you understand that this is just a better scenario of going about this project, but you need to control it. So that's an example of how you can approach this problem. Right, so my last meaningful slide today, it's just some basic steps that need to be performed if you decide to launch a machine translation program in your organization. I'm not going to walk you over all these steps again, because we've covered many of them during this webinar, and to discuss it in depth, we'll need much more time and probably more webinars. So again, it's more for your future reference when you get the link to this recording. Okay, and this is all from me today, and now we can move to our Q&A session. I'm not sure we'll have much time for it today because, well, it definitely took more time than I expected, but we'll certainly answer all your questions. If not now, then later via email, or maybe addressing them in our future webinars. So we'll find them all. And now, Eloisa, the floor is yours again. So what do we have?
All right, so our first question is, how do you calculate edit distance?
Well, yeah, so well, if it's on a more technical note, so which specific formula do we use for that? So because, well, there are very generic algorithms to do that, so we just use a library. I don't know, it's probably a question that I should ask our R&D people who deal with it day in, day out. So, but basically you just see how many replacements you need to do to go from one version of text to the other version. So it's one of those very well-known algorithms. Okay.
All right. Another question is, what do you do if you catch your translator red-handed using machine translation?
Yeah, right. Well, that's a good question. There is no one single, again, no silver bullet. So it may be that this particular project is should be strictly guarded from any kind of machine translation. And on the whole, we have these agreements with all our contractors that they shouldn't use machine translation without telling us. So it can be from finding this person if we understand that this is because they just don't want to work properly. But in most cases, it's kind of a discussion. We need to understand what urged this person to use this machine translation in the first place. So if they use it to work better, more efficiently, then we just need to manage this. So we need to, so instead of having them go to these free services, we need to and copy pasting back and forth, we can use our corporate accounts and our corporate protected models to translate it for them in advance. And this will be better for our clients, for us, and for them as well. So it's always a discussion.
All right. And our last question today is, you mentioned checking for machine translation in data sets before you start training. And how do you do that?
Right. So similarly to what we do, and I showed it on one of the slides, right? So when we monitor our current flow of translations to see if any unsanctioned use of machine translation occurred. So the very same thing we do with data sets. So we just have an algorithm that compares segments of this data set with the outputs of different machine translation engines. And it's empirical thing, so you can't say for sure, but in most cases, just looking at the graphs that are plotted, you can see if any segments look suspicious, and you just can remove them from your data set to make sure that you really deal with a human-produced output rather than machine-translated output. Okay, so
all right.
Do we have any more questions?
There are no more questions in our Q&A box, but we invite all attendees to, if you have a question, you can type it right now.
Okay. Okay, and as I said, so we'll keep in touch. And if you have any other questions or any topics for our future webinars, and let me just show my last slide. Here it is. So any new topics, or you want to get in touch and discuss any problems or use cases that you might have in relation to machine translation, you're always welcome. So please write to us at info@effective.com or get in touch via any other channel. And probably this is it for today, right? And so thanks everyone for coming. It was nice having this webinar and spending this hour with you. So have a nice day.